Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I am going to try in these next few minutes to just give you a little bit of the content overviews related to the spread of the Protestant Reformation. This is much less about the rise of Martin Luther and his role as a monk and some of the initial activities that he goes about doing in the University of Wittenberg, and how he has, kind of almost immediately a variety of followers. So that part of the Protestant Reformation is significant, and it's really something that is, kind of the beginning parts and really relates to a couple of key questions. Why does Luther go about doing this? And we know that some of the trigger, in a sense, for him is the issue of the indulgences, which he finds, appalling. But he does develop a unique religious following that's based on a few core beliefs. One is the priesthood of all believers. So he kind of reduces the role of what at the time was a significant role for Roman Catholic priests, and especially the Pope. He kind of changes up the hierarchy, and the authority becomes much more connected to believers themselves. So in some ways, this is kind of like a humanist action. It seems to be that people are able to interpret, and have some degree of understanding the text of the Bible themselves. That's like another connection that Luther makes in addition to priesthood of all believers. He sees the text of the Bible as really dictating, in a sense, what the religious belief system will be about. And the biggest change is he refutes the Catholic Church's view of good works. This idea that there's some role for the individuals, and maybe in this one realm Luther is rejecting some of humanism, or at least it sounds that way. Somebody like Erasmus, who was a humanist, would suggest that people are in the own driver's seats, able to get to heaven, so people could do good works. And Luther kind of says, no amount of good works, no matter what you do as a person, good or bad, you just have to have faith, and that faith alone is going to essentially enable salvation. It's really not up to you, it's up to this higher power. And, perhaps you can see that as something very different than Renaissance humanism. And maybe it's in that way that the Reformation kind of takes on something a little bit different, right? It challenges some humanist ideas as well as it embraces some of them, like the idea of using classical texts or whichever. But in any case, if we look at the spread of the Reformation beyond Martin Luther and Wittenberg, we come up with some of the case studies that you guys looked at in your fish bowls. And because I heard a lot of what you guys said, I'll be able to address some of those comments and some things that you guys said kind of as a group, and some interesting commentaries. So what we're looking at here is a map in about 1560. So this is about 40 years after Luther nails the 95 Theses in Wittenberg, and this becomes a description of where we see Roman Catholicism and where we see Calvinism, where we see Anglicanism and Lutheranism. And the red, the green, and the purple all represent Protestantism. One place, of course, we don't see the Protestant Reformation travel to is Spain. Spain is largely under kind of a hybrid state that is partially the state, but the state has also kind of powered with the Roman Catholic Church, so the state and the church are very tied together. Okay, and we see as Spain ends up becoming a colonial power, the mindset and belief system of Roman Catholicism and the church itself will have a presence in places like modern day South America and the Philippines, for example. Okay. There's also, and you can kind of see within the area of the Netherlands, we see kind of a Spanish Catholic connection, as well as part of the Netherlands that becomes Calvinist. Okay, we see Calvinism in places like Scotland, so Calvinism will become the Presbyterians in Scotland. We see in France kind of hodgepodges of Calvinism. The green in France is representative of French Huguenots. They are essentially French Calvinists. We also see in Geneva, Switzerland, Calvinists. This is kind of be almost the home base for John Calvin, and what becomes a city that is entirely based as a not a political state, but essentially a religious state based on Calvinism. And we also see Germany, Sweden, Norway, some of the Scandinavian countries, maybe a little bit into Poland, and kind of the area of Prussia becoming Lutheran. We do see during the Reformation a good part of Poland reverting back to Roman Catholicism. So that's another place where we see a variety of religious beliefs. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how much the map suggests a greater degree of religious diversity. Before Luther, this map would be completely yellow. It was largely all under Roman Catholicism. England is like its own church. We see part of Ireland embracing that too. Just like today, Ireland has a Roman Catholic as well as a Protestant kind of shared. There's been a lot of religious tension between those groups, right? And that kind of gets to Northern Ireland versus other areas of Ireland. Kind of a longer history than we need to go into today. But if we look at some of this, let's see if we can get to some of the issues of church and state. Okay, and I'm going to try to be mindful of my time here. One of the examples that we could look at, and a lot of you noted this in your fishbowl and noted it in your comments, so I think it's one that you largely understand, but you can kind of see how the Holy Roman Empire becomes this hodgepodge of political issues as well as religious issues. Okay, so we know that the Holy Roman Empire is going to be where Luther is going to make his case, and he develops a lot of followers. One of the groups that follows him will be college students, so we see a lot of activity in theology at universities, but we also see groups of princes follow Luther, and in particular places, especially in the north, we see a lot of princes taking on Lutheran beliefs, and this means they will reject the Catholic Church and essentially take over the monasteries and the Catholic Church that might be existing in their principalities. And some of this might be done so that princes have greater sovereignty, and they also gain all the economic resources of the Catholic Church within their sovereign regions. But we see some societies essentially declaring themselves as Lutheran societies. Charles V will demand that Lutherans return to Catholicism. So Charles V, who is the grandchild of Isabella and Ferdinand, and at this time has power in places of the Holy Roman Empire, but also over Catholic places like Spain, is trying to have like an international approach. This is all about kind of, all of his lands of Habsburg Empire fitting under Catholicism. And in reaction, the Lutheran states end up forming what's called the Schmalkaldic League, okay? Just call it like a League of Lutheran States. They're basically saying to Charles V, no way, we're not going to do this, and we're staying Lutheran, and we'll fight together, okay? And that's essentially what happens. There's a series of religious wars. We see this incredible amount of conflict. The military power of Charles V is going to go against the Schmalkaldic League, and as a result, in an effort to try to establish peace, the Peace of Augsburg is delivered. And this does have, as some of you guys noted, maybe some greater ability to have some religious diversity. At least Lutheranism is considered to be a possibility as long as it's the religion that's picked by the German prince. So a German prince in one area could stay Roman Catholic, a prince in another area of the Holy Roman Empire could become Lutheran, and everybody in those political regions would have to follow the rule of the prince. So certainly this is not individual belief systems are reigning by any means, and there's no alternative to Lutheran or Catholic. So it's religious diversity in a map sense, but it is not inclusive of even Calvinist religions, right? And definitely not inclusive of groups that are non-Christian. So this is not by any means religious diversity, but it is a society that's kind of contemplating how to deal with religious diversity in a time when the alternative seems to be war. And Charles V kind of eventually in time will abdicate his throne. He is not ever able to create a Catholic state, and he tries and tries, but does not see religion as a way to unify. Okay, and a lot of princes just see Charles V as an outsider. He's not German. He is not somebody that he's a Habsburg. Lots of people don't like that. He has objectives also in Spain, and he will piece up part of the empire and give it to his heirs and siblings and whatnot. We also see the Anabaptists, and this becomes an interesting group because probably they're the group that is most likely to say we are not going to be part of a political state. So they look at this role of church and state and say this should be different, right? Religion shouldn't have anything to do with the king. Okay, so this to some degree smacks of some freedom of consciousness. Perhaps individuals get to choose whether or not they become Anabaptist. And not only do they choose that, they decide to make that choice as an adult, right? So nobody is brought into the religion as a baby, right? This is only something adults can choose. And they actually set up a new community in Munster in the 1530s. Lots and lots of other religions, Roman Catholic and Protestant, will see the Anabaptists as anathema. Okay, they essentially are like controversial to every other religious group, and they will receive a great deal of brutality. In Munster, they are set up for horrific attack. In fact, there's still cages that hang from a chapel in Munster where Anabaptists were flayed. You know, their skin was cut off and their bones were left to rot in a cage, you know, to remind people. In reality, the Anabaptists do become a religious community that does have roots even in the United States. They are connected to modern day groups like the Mennonites. Largely, the Anabaptists move into being a very kind of segregated religious community with their own rules and laws. So despite the fact that they reject the state, it does become a fairly rigid kind of belief system. And once people commit to it, the religious laws kind of define behavior for people in that religion. But the religion does also connect to principles of pacifism, so less about, you know, war, that type of thing. And they are horrifically oppressed. So, you know, definitely not the majority of Christians. But Anabaptists are kind of an interesting group. And you'll see that in the Holy Roman Empire, but also in places like Switzerland. These are some of the images that kind of suggest the slaughter of Anabaptists, particularly in the religious community that they establish. Probably the most significant kind of offshoot to Martin Luther is John Calvin for a couple of reasons. So he writes a work called Institutes of the Christian Religion, and this is in 1536. It is a hugely popular writing, and his writing kind of is instrumental in a lot of Protestant religions even to this day. He believes that individuals are only able to receive kind of the ability to go to heaven if they are elected. That being part of the elect comes from predestination, the idea that no individual can do anything about getting into heaven. So it kind of follows the belief of faith alone, but even in addition to that, there's an idea that there's predestined, that it's, determined whether or not, somebody is going to go to heaven or not. And of course, most of the people who become Calvinists believe that they are part of the elect. So it's not that they don't do good works. They do a lot of good works to show others that they are part of the elect. It becomes kind of the norm of behaving like somebody's elect. So if you do something wrong, you're like ostracized by the community because you're not clearly part of the elect. Okay, this develops in a city in Geneva as a very, very almost like a religious community. So Calvin's kind of religious followers kind of come to Geneva and set up essentially almost like a Calvinist community where believers buy into all of the views of John Calvin. And this particular, kind of model is something that's maybe a more theocratic model. There's a group known as the consistory. They are almost like a moral police. So there is a government, but the government is led by a church leader. So this is the model where we see the church kind of is the state, okay? This becomes important because this model is going to move to other places. We'll see Calvinists in France, known as the Huguenots. We see Calvinists in Scotland, known as the Presbyterians. We'll see Calvinists in England, known as the Puritans. And we'll also see Calvinists throughout the area of Switzerland. And this becomes a group that is going to be influential in the Americas, right? In North America in particular. and Calvinism does spread, okay? There's a few things that are different between Calvin and Luther, because you might ask yourself, aren't they the same? I'll get to that in the next video.